There's something different about this wood. Hi, I'm Kent and welcome to Turn a Wood Bowl. There's either something wrong with this wood or it might be box elder. Yeah, I think that's what we've got going on here. This is box elder, and it's my first piece of box elder to turn on the lathe ever, and you guys get to see it. So this should be pretty exciting. I'm actually really looking forward to turning this and see what comes out of it. Now I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to break some rules. If you saw my other video where I broke the rule about including the pith in the side of the bowl, I think I'm going to do that with this, because look at that great big color burst going around the pith. I don't want to cut this in half and waste some of that. I want to expose as much of that as possible. However, since I've never turned box elder, I don't know what's going to happen. The pith area might come apart. Hopefully it won't do that, but we'll just have to see, and we're going to take that risk. Also, I have no idea how this turns, so I'm going to take my time. I'm going to make sure my bowl gouges are really sharp, make sure we get good clean cuts for each of the passes on this, and we'll see what we come up with. Now, I want to make this as big as possible from the piece that I have here. So I'm going to make a relatively large bowl. I'm probably going to have the sides come in and have a closed top, because this log is a little bit unusual in the way it was cut. So I've got this side over here, but then it comes in a little bit. So the top might be a little narrower than the sides of this bowl, if that makes any sense. We'll talk about that more as we're turning. So for right now, I'm going to take this over to the bandsaw, and we're going to trim off some of these corners so that we can put it on a lathe and get started. I'm going to take my circle template that fits this pretty well. It's actually a little larger than the top part of the bark here, and I'm looking straight down, and I'm really eyeballing the corners and trying to see where this is positioned. I want to see where that pith is. I want to try to get that pith as close to the center as possible. And I'm going to drive my awl in here just to hold that template in place as I'm trimming. Now I'm going to trim off the corners here. This is not going to make a perfectly cylindrical blank by any means. This is a kind of an odd shaped piece of box elder, but we're going to make do with what we can here. I'm going to take off the corners on the outside here and just slowly work this around. You always want to let the bandsaw blade do the work. Don't force the wood into the saw. Just let it do its cutting and let it cut through. And if for some reason it's not cutting and you're forcing it into it, then you really need to check and see if that blade needs to be replaced. The other thing, safety-wise, is you want to remember that the bandsaw has different levels of difficulty. When it's going through the mass of the material, obviously it's going to cut the slowest. But right here, when it's only cutting a sliver, if you're applying the same pressure, it's going to come out of that very quickly, and that's where problems can happen. So just want to be aware of that. Be super alert around any type of power equipment, but obviously the bandsaw in particular. Be aware of everything that's going on. Do not be distracted. All right, this is looking pretty good. We've got a bowl blank here. Now I'm going to take the chisel and hammer, and I'm going to, or mallet, and I'm going to clean off the bark for the area that will be holding the blank on the lathe. I'm going to be using my spur drive center to mount this, and the reason I'm going to be using the spur drive center is I'm going to need to move this blank around. If I were to use a face plate or a screw chuck, they're not going to give me the ability to make adjustments and move this piece the way I need to so that I can balance the overall look and pattern of it. Okay, so that's enough cleared out there, and I'm going to mount this to the spur chuck and the live center on the tailstock. Going to bring those in place, and then I'm going to take a little time to line this up. First thing I want to start with is taking a look at the top bark edge and where that is positioned. I want those two top wings to be at the same height. So in other words, if I just threw this in randomly and I have one wing up high, it might look okay, but it's probably going to look off balance. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to see that the pith is lined up on both sides. And that's looking pretty good too. So I think we've got the blank where I want it. Now, like I mentioned in the intro, I definitely need to have sharp tools for this. So I'm going to take my time. Before any turning, I take my time and sharpen my tools. But I'm going to be sharpening up the bowl gouges pretty frequently through this turning as well. And again, when your sharpening station is set up, you're only going to need to come over here briefly. This is in real time. I'm not cutting anything out. You can see exactly what I did there. It only takes a few seconds to put a nice sharp edge on that bowl gouge. Now this is my 5/8 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. And I know somebody, my brother, likes teasing me for saying that, but it's what it is, and I say it. So he will point out that the 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge is his favorite tool too. So anyway, it's kind of a funny thing, a little inside joke that we've got there. But the 55-degree bevel is the bevel that I'm comfortable with, and you need to do what works best for you. It doesn't mean that this is for everybody. There's people that use other bowl gouges, bevel angles as well. There's nothing wrong with that. What I'm doing here is I'm roughing off the corners. I'm just basically taking off the high spots of these corners. This is going to take a little bit of time because, again, this is not a perfectly cylindrical bowl blank. What I'm doing is I'm curving the bottom shape of the bowl. So in one pass or a series of passes, I'm shaping the bottom of the bowl and the bottom side of the bowl all at the same time and establishing the curve of the bottom of the bowl. I need to thank Thurman, a friend of mine who gave me this chunk of box elder. He actually has a wood bowl blank processing, or actually wood turning or wood blank service, and I'll put a link to his business in the description below. But he got this piece for me from Georgia, and it's really exciting because this is not something that we have locally here in my area, and it's neat to be able to turn different types of wood species. Now, box elder is in the maple family. It's a maple tree. And the red staining that you see in it it's not quite understood exactly what causes that. However, it is known that trees react to a variety of different environmental aspects, such as insects or changes in their environment, with the process of developing and releasing chemicals. And most likely this is a reaction to either an injury to the tree or to an infestation of insects or possibly a fungus or bacteria. The tree is reacting to that, and it's creating its own chemicals to fight that. In this case, we can actually see this red chemical. There are other trees that use other different methods, and most of the time when you see a color in wood, it is a chemical reaction that tree has developed over its lifespan, or the many generations and evolutions of that tree. It's a reaction to the environment, something that's going on, it is reacting to it, and it counters that. And many times it's pests or things of that nature. There are many trees that have developed chemical reactions that prevent insects from eating it or damaging the bark and that. So it's not quite understood exactly why the box elder tree has this red stain, but obviously it's very unique and it's quite beautiful. So these are highly sought after, and I'm hoping this turns out to be a really nice looking bowl that will feature that red outside stained look that goes through it. Now I'm just making very light passes here, and I'm trying to get down to a continuous cut. We still have some voids in this, so it's not quite a smooth cut yet. And we're getting close to that area where this will be smooth all the way across. Look at that stain. Now I'm noticing there's a lot of punkiness, especially on this one side. Around the pith area is very punky. And now when I say punky, that's basically loose fibers that are starting to decompose. If this were to sit around much longer, another year or so, this blank might be pretty much useless. So I'm going to switch over to my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge. And I'm going to clean up the base of this bowl and get this ready to put a tenon in place. And I'm a little concerned about that punkiness. Again, the punkiness is wood fibers that have started to decompose, and they cause a problem when we're turning because they're not firm like most of the other portions of the bowl blank. They're typically very soft and spongy, and they don't want to cut smoothly. And if we go about this too rapidly, or we make aggressive cuts, we're going to be ripping out those fibers. And it's very difficult to get a smooth finish on punky wood if we're aggressive. So we're going to need to make smooth, very sharp, thin cuts on the exterior of this bowl in order to make that punky area look good. Here I've turned the cylinder for the tenon and the cylinder for the shoulder of this bowl. Now the reason I do this, wow, there's a big punky area. That is causing some worry. I'll have some techniques here I'll share with you guys of how to deal with punky wood. Now the reason I established that tenon and shoulder area first is I want to establish the base of the bowl, or the relative area of the base of the bowl, so that I can use that as my connecting point to the rim. And I'm going to go right back to curving the outer bottom portion of the bowl as I was doing in the beginning, and bring that curve up from the shoulder up into the side of the bowl. So I'm going to start establishing the shape of the bowl. I'm taking my time here and making relatively light cuts. I want to see what happens with this punky wood and make sure that it is going to cut smoothly. Now don't get discouraged if you've got a piece of wood that's punky. Now if the whole thing's punky and it's falling apart and you've got pieces flying at you, then you might want to give that up. This is punky in a couple isolated areas, so I'm still optimistic about this bowl. I think we're going to be able to come up with a decent piece here. And look at that. Wow. Going across that at an angle or around the curve of the bottom of the bowl really reveals that color, and that red burst. That's just amazing. So I'm going to shape down into the shoulder a bit. And I'm looking at the overall shape of the outside of this, and I'm looking at the fact that this is a large, almost square cylinder, meaning the width of it is almost as wide as the height. So it's going to be a little tricky to get a nice curved shaped bowl out of this. So that's part of the reason why I brought the shoulder up a bit, which also brings the bottom of the bowl up a bit, so that it's not quite as tall. I'm not trying to make a hollow form or a vase here. I really want to make a nice looking bowl. Okay, then those cuts I made were pretty aggressive, and you can really see the effect there in the end grain. It just ripped out all of that punky area. That's going to be the most aggressive cuts that I'll do for the rest of this turning, because if I get more aggressive, it's going to just continue to rip that out. Now, what punky wood does and what makes those little pit marks is basically the fibers they're weak and they break way below the surface, and then they leave those pitted areas that are obviously visible and very clear to see. And that is what causes the problem. So what we need to do is we need to make clean cuts right over that area. And one of the tricks I use to cut punky wood a little bit cleaner is to put shellac on it. Shellac, and this is natural shellac. I've got a video all about how to make shellac. This shellac is basically used as an adhesive. I'm using this as like a glue at this point. It's essentially soaking down into those loose, weak fibers and gluing them together. and making them more solid so that when I come across the top of that with my sharp bowl gouge, it's going to cut those fibers cleanly as opposed to just knocking them around. That's kind of what it's been doing at this point. So I'm going to let that dry, and while it's drying, I'm going to go back to the sharpening station and sharpen my bowl gouge again. You're going to want to stop frequently and sharpen up and refresh the edge of that bowl gouge to make sure it's good and sharp, especially when we're making the final passes on this torn out end grain or this punky end grain. A couple back and forth passes over the sharpening wheel and we should be set here. What I'm looking for is I want to make sure that the bevel is nice and clean all the way up to the cutting edge. Okay, so I'm going to continue shaping from the base of the bowl up. And remember, our trouble area is in the center of the side right now. And that's that pith area that has the real loose punky fibers in it. So I'm going to make light cuts there. You can see I've slowed my pace down as well. I'm not trying to go across this aggressively. And look at all those shavings coming off nice and crisp. You can see the difference already. The area that I just cut is much smoother than the area that remains to be cut. You can see it right there. The punky area is still looking really rough. But by making a nice, clean, smooth cut there, I was able to clean up that surface pretty nicely. Okay, so I'm working from the top rim down because I want to maintain the fibers along the rim of this bowl. I'm already sensing that the bark probably isn't going to hold. I don't think this is going to be a live edge bowl. It's probably going to be a natural edge. That pith area is still a problem, but you can see the difference here from the clean cut, and then the rough punky area. I'm going to move the tool rest up a bit. And I've got a low spot there too, so I'm not down to the final level at this point. I'm just making very light cuts with a very sharp tool. You can see how thin that cut is. I was actually about ready to lose it. It was so thin, so I'm going to go back and make a little bit deeper cut. But what this is doing is just gently shaving out those broken off fibers so that we'll be left with a more clean surface. That's looking pretty good. I'm still worried about that pith area. There's an actual hole there, so I'm going to have to do something to address that. The shellac helps a lot. It stiffens up those fibers. If you want to make your own shellac, it's actually pretty easy. You basically just need shellac flakes and you need alcohol. You can use denatured alcohol. However, the new standards for denatured alcohol include oil, so it has oil in it, and it's a lot of times it's labeled as camping fuel or cooking fuel or heating fuel, and that's not the best to be using. So what you want to do is you want to get actual pure alcohol. Now you can buy that like at a liquor store, but I've actually found a source. I had a viewer that left a comment and had a really good source for a company in Maine. If you're in the United States, I don't know if they will ship worldwide, but I will put a link to this company in the description below. And they sell 200 proof, which is pure ethanol, corn alcohol, and it is what they say is food grade. There's that pith area. You can see the hole, but you can see the clean cut to the right of that. You can see how the fibers are still real rough to the left, but to the right where I cut, it's starting to clean up. So it's looking promising. I'm going to use the shear scrape method to smooth that surface out a little bit more. But back to the shellac and the alcohol. It's a 200 proof food grade alcohol, pure alcohol is ethanol essentially, and I don't know what food that would be used in. I'm guessing it's used as some type of ingredient for different things, or even maybe for cleaning. I don't know, but it's pure alcohol. I don't think you want to consume much of that because it would obviously cause problems. But it is perfect for diluting the shellac. And like I said, I'll put a link to that in the description below. Now I'll put a link to all the tools that I use in this video as well in the description below. Actually, I do that with all my videos. So if you look in the description on YouTube, you can see all the different tools and equipment and products that I use. In this case, I'm using 5-minute epoxy. I decided I'm going to put some 5-minute epoxy in that pith area, in that void, just to solidify it and to hold it together so that it doesn't further pull apart down the road. And the 5-minute epoxy is super easy to use, much simpler than any of the epoxy resins that you see that are pretty popular now. This sets up very quickly, and I can get back to turning in a short period of time. Whereas the resins that are used to make casts and cast bull blanks, those need to cure overnight. This is something that can be put on in an instant like this, and then in a few moments I'll be able to turn this again. Just using a couple toothpicks, actually the toothpicks I use to mix this, to get that epoxy down into that hole and fill that area really well. I'm going to do the same for the other side, but here you can see what this looks like once the epoxy is in place. Now that the epoxy is set up, I'm going to apply another coat of shellac. Now the other thing, I get a lot of questions from overseas, from other countries, and that the denatured alcohol is available in the United States, but like I said, again, it does have oil in it now, which it never had that before, and that's not ideal for the shellac that you're using. So you're going to really want to use a pure alcohol. You could use potentially vodka, like a very high proof vodka, or a grain alcohol like that. If you're in a foreign country, they don't sell denatured alcohol. Again, you're going to basically look for pure ethanol or the highest grade ethanol that you can find, alcohol. And that's what you're going to use to dilute the shellac flakes. And the alcohol that's used in this basically just dissolves, or evaporates rather, and it leaves behind all of the shellac that is dissolved in the alcohol. So it's basically the carrier or the vehicle to deliver the shellac. And in this case, it soaks down into those fibers and allows them to get stiff. They stiffen up from the shellac. That's the whole purpose for doing this. And it allows a really clean cut. So I'm making very light cuts here with my sharp 1/2-inch bowl gouge. You can see how thin the cuts are there. Just making very, very, very light passes. And look at that. The end grain has really cleaned up quite nicely. I've got a couple high spots there I need to deal with, so I'm going to use my bowl gouge and I'm going to shear scrape those high spots. Shear scraping is a very subtle way. It's more like shaving. We're basically just shaving away high spots. I've got a video all about shear scraping. You're going to want to check that out. This is a great technique. If I were to keep going back at this and make a cutting pass, inevitably I would make a deeper pass and a deeper pass, or I'd make a different groove and I would try to go back and correct that. And if you do that over and over again, you reduce the overall size of your bowl and the shape of it, and you lose control over that. By using the shear scrape here, I'm just shaving off light areas and leveling the surface without doing much destruction or any quick drastic changes of the shape. Instead, these are very light, very easy passes that just take off a little bit of material. Think of it more like shaving. This is what shear scraping is. It is definitely like shaving. Now, the epoxy that I put in that pith area, I did not color it. I did not add any dust to it. I could have added some dust to it. It's going to look a little bit plasticky, and I'm fine with that. I think this piece has got enough random shapes and colors going on that it's not going to be that noticeable. If this were a pure, solid, smooth colored wood, yeah, that pith area being filled with epoxy would be a problem. Okay, now I'm going to go in with my spindle detail gouge, and I'm going to clean up the bottom angle of the tenon so that it seats well in the 4-jaw chuck. Now, why did I do this now? Well, if the bowl shifted at all when I was turning or moved around a little bit, by making the final passes and shape of that tenon at this point, it's going to be the last position that this bowl was in, and it'll be closely matching that. If I had made this the tenon and cleaned it up at the very beginning of this bowl, and somehow something has shifted, well, that tenon is going to be out of alignment with the rest of the bowl. By doing it last, it is in alignment with the last cuts I was making on this bowl. And here you can see how that seats at the top of the jaws, but the tenon does not go into the bottom of the 4-jaw chuck. That is very, very important. Now, I've got videos all about the tenon, how to make the tenon incorrectly, and you can learn a lot from those. So check those out. The best way to do that is go, if you haven't already, go to my channel, and you can do that by clicking on the name Turn a Wood Bowl underneath this video. And then click on the videos at the top of my page. You're going to see my logo up there, and then at the top you're going to see videos. If you click that, you will see a great big long page with all of my videos on it. You're going to want to dig through there because I've got a ton of great information for you. Now, I brought the tailstock up there just to stabilize this piece a little bit as I was turning it, but obviously it's going to be in the way, so I'm going to pull that back out and I'm going to continue turning. I'm going to clear away a little bit of this bark material on the top. And I can tell by the way it's cutting, and I can tell by the way, you can just tell the firmness of the bark compared to the wood underneath. This bark is not going to hold on. So this is not going to be a live edge bowl. Don't remember, a live edge bowl has the bark included, and a natural edge bowl is the organic outside of the bowl but without the bark. So I'm going to make passes in here to clear out an area so that I can start working the inside wall and work my way down the interior of this bowl. Now, a question that I'm already anticipating that I know somebody is going to ask is, why not core this out and get a whole bunch of other bowls? Well, I could do that. However, in order to do that and do it well, I would have to completely change the design of this bowl, and I'd have to do something that is more akin to a flatter bowl that is not quite as interesting or dynamic as this. Because I have this closed rim, meaning the rim is narrower than the widest part of the bowl, and there's the bark coming off. So I'm just going to go ahead and start pulling it off. I can see that it's just barely holding on. So I'm going to take that off. But because the rim is narrower than the widest part of the bowl, if I were to core out another bowl blank from this, I could do it. It would just be a very small bowl blank, and it's not gonna yield much. It's not gonna give me that much to work with. I would make a little saucer with it. It's basically all I'd be able to do. If I really wanted to core this, I would not do a bowl shape like this. So the question is this, what you really need to ask yourself is, do I want to make a whole bunch of bowls that I really am not too concerned with the overall design of them, or would I rather make one really nice bowl that has an interesting design to it? And that's kind of where I'm at right now with this bowl, and that's why I'm not coring this out. It's also why I did not go through the traditional methods of making a bowl blank. Now, a traditional bowl blank, we usually completely remove the pith area by cutting the log in half. So this piece would yield 2 bowl blanks. Now I'm actually above and I'm on the right side of the lathe here, and I wanted to show you guys this angle by shooting straight down so you can see this. But my body's on the right side of the lathe, and I'm working across the lathe and setting up this cut to establish the wall thickness for this bowl. But you can see how far I need to reach in order to get into that wall, because it's closed and the angle of that wall is essentially backwards, and I'm going on the other side of the lathe to make that work out. Okay, so back to the idea of how we're shaping this. Now, in a traditional bowl blank, now if I made a traditional bowl with this, and this weren't interesting box elder, which of course it is interesting box elder, but if it weren't, I would not want to be messing with that pith. So I would have cut this blank in half. Now, that's great and all, but I would have reduced the size of the potential bowl by half. So instead of having this nice 8 or 10 inch tall bowl, about 25 centimeters high, I would have something half that size, maybe 4 or 5 inches tall and 8 centimeters or 10 centimeters tall. It would be much smaller, and it would be a much smaller bowl in the overall shape. I wouldn't be able to get an interesting outer bowl from it. But I would also be avoiding that pith area. So it's give and take. And in this instance, I've decided, you know what? I'm willing to deal with that pith area and the potential troubles that it might render in exchange for having a really interesting bowl to look at. In this case, it's a very large, almost globe or round, spherical shaped bowl that is very unique and different compared to a traditional just half sphere bowl. So that's where I'm at with that. I'm still reaching across the lathe. You can see I've got to make a big wide or a big reach to get into that wall. Now I'm working down the wall and clearing out the center as I go. You can see I'm working the wall here, just light cuts until I get down to the previous depth. And once that depth is established, I'm not going back up that wall. The other thing that I'm doing here is I'm stopping frequently and using my hands to check that wall thickness. If it appears thicker down at the base of this, then I need to make more cuts. And you don't want to get too aggressive when you're going into making that wall thickness. You want to do it at slow increments and kind of sneak up on the wall thickness. If you get too aggressive, especially down in the bowl, deeper down in the bowl, and you cut too much, you may have an area of the wall thickness that's thinner than the area above that, and there is no good way to fix that. If you go back up to the higher wall, you're going to have flexing and you're going to have issues. You're going to have poor cutting quality or a poor bowl blank to be working on because those wings right now are flexing. This wood is not 100% dry, and even if it were, at this size and at this speed, there's still going to be flexing of that outside wall. Just take your time and reduce the center core, the center mass of this bowl as you work your way down. The other interesting thing that's kind of fun when you're doing a closed rim bowl where the rim is narrower than the outer or the widest point of the bowl, you always have these shavings that get trapped inside there. They can't get out. Just that little bit of a lip that turns in. You can almost barely see it. It only turns in just a bit, but it's enough to hold all those shavings in. Okay, I need to get into the bottom of this bowl with a little bit more support from the tool rest. So I'm going to use my longer J tool rest. And that's going to give me more stability because the bowl gouge doesn't have to extend quite as far away from the tool rest like it was doing just a moment ago. Again, sneaking up on that wall thickness, very light cuts. I'm going back and then I'm merging these cuts together with a very light, very intentional pass. Then I'll stop and check that wall thickness. Take your time and go nice and slow here. And get your hands in there and feel that wall thickness and make sure that it's where you want it to be. Here you can see what's happening. I need to be aware of that rim too, because it's organic shaped and irregular. I need to remember that a portion of it is coming right next to the tool rest, and I need to keep my hands out of there. You can also see how the bowl gouge is almost touching the rim here. This is my 55-degree bevel, 5/8 inch swept back bowl gouge. It does a great job for reaching down in there, but it's about to get in the way of the rim. So I'm going to need to switch to a different bowl gouge. Now, it's interesting because the 55-degree bevel will get down into the bottom of a pretty deep bowl. This is a pretty deep bowl that's almost spherical, and it's doing a good job. It's another reason why I like this particular bowl gouge profile. I'm getting down to the final passes down there in the wall, and the last few cuts that you make, no matter where it is, if it's on the outside or the inside, you really want to make sure your tool is nice and sharp. So go back to your sharpening station and just freshen up that edge. Make sure the bevel's nice and clean all the way up to the cutting edge, and you're going to get a much better result. So I'm going to continue working the interior of this bowl. Now what I was getting at is, you can see here the handle, you can see the shaft of the bowl gouge is getting close to the rim. And I obviously don't want this hitting the rim because it will damage the bowl. So that means we need to switch tools. And the tool that I'm going to switch to is my micro bevel bowl gouge. Now the micro bevel bowl gouge, instead of having swept back wings, it has a rolled profile on the nose, and it is set up at 65 degrees. It's only 10 degrees different than my 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge, but that angle allows me to go almost straight in. You can see how I'm connecting to that curve, but the shaft of the tool is nowhere near the rim of the bowl. And that's exactly what I need right here to finish up the bottom of this bowl. Now I've got a video all about the micro bevel, which you might have imagined, and you can check that out if you want to learn more about it. But I highly recommend using a micro bevel. I would recommend using the micro bevel above anything else, and especially above scraping, because scraping essentially is going to rip out fibers very easily. This could be scraped and it could come out clean, but more times than not, scraping is going to create more issues. You really want to cut the fiber, especially with wood that has a little bit of an issue like this does. Okay, there's a little bit of an issue on the rim. There's a fine crack there, and I'm going to use some wood glue to fix that very quickly. We've covered this technique in my cracks video. If you haven't seen that, you definitely want to check that out. It's a very simple technique. Look at that. That crack almost disappeared. And it's going to be held together here, so it should not continue. Now I'm going to take my time and I'm going to sand this. I'm going to go around the sides of this. Now any bowl that is natural edge or live edge, when you're cutting the air is what happens. You have the non-continuous cuts along the top of the bowl. You're going to get tool marks. So you're going to take your time without the lathe running, and you want to clean those up. Now here I'm using the edge of the sanding pad to take away any of the cambium layer that's underneath the bark. I want to clean up that rim, but I also need to be careful. I want to follow the contour of the rim. I don't want to just flatten off that rim, because that would defeat the whole purpose of what we're doing with a natural edge bowl. Instead, I want to expose the underlying material, but I don't want to have any of the bark included. So I'm just using the sander to remove that bark. I'm not really using it to reshape that edge. And here you can see I've gone through the grits. I went from 120 to 180, 240, 320, and I'm finishing up 320 on the interior of this. And I got to tell you, even with that punkiness, this wood sands out very nicely. And yeah, the punky area wasn't the greatest. I would prefer that not to be there. But you got to work with what you've got, and all in all, this has actually turned out to be pretty good. A lot of times with punky wood, it'll get really mushy and it doesn't sand very well. But this is sanding like maple, which it is. It's in the maple family. So I'm using my jam chuck here, and I'm going to reverse the bowl and I mount it. held in place with the live center on the tailstock. And I'm going to take the shoulder down. I don't want the foot of this bowl to be this large. Now you might be thinking, well, why didn't you just make the foot before you started? Well, I needed the larger shoulder and tenon so that I had good stability when I'm turning this, and the 4-jaw chuck had plenty of material to hold on to so that it wasn't coming loose while I'm turning. If you have a small, very flimsy tenon on the bottom of a large bowl like this, it's not going to support the piece when you're clearing out the inside. Instead, you have a nice large shoulder and tenon that supports and makes it easy to clear out that inside. And then afterwards, when you're at this stage, then you can remove that what you need to, and you have all that material to design the foot that you want for this bowl. So I'm taking the size down, obviously, and I'm going to make a foot that cuts back into the bowl a little bit, so it's tapered back a little bit. And here you can see that profile a little bit better. I'm going to take the foot down right to this point, make a nice crisp corner there. And I'll just turn the bowl gouge, and I can do a little bit of shear scraping and clean that surface just a touch there so it blends in nicely. And while it's still mounted, I'm going to go ahead and sand that area so that it's sanded at the same level or to the same level that the rest of the exterior of the bowl is. Now I'll come back in with my 1/2 inch 55-degree bevel swept back bowl gouge, and I will shape and locate the bottom of the foot. I could have made this taller, but when I'm looking at this from the side and looking at the profile, it seems it was too tall, so I shortened it just a bit. Now I'm going to make the inside of this area concave. I just want the exterior rim of the foot to be touching the table or surface that it sits on. Now I'm stopping the lathe to check and make sure there's no weak material in this little nub. If there was any punky material in there, I would have to stop at this point, and I would have to basically just sand that area down the best I could. But luckily there's decent material there, and I've got a good solid connection. The other thing too to keep in mind when you're using a jam chuck like this, and you've reduced down to a little nub like I've got right now, do not apply more pressure with the tailstock. Just leave it to where you had it tightened before you cleared that area away, and don't tighten it anymore. The reason being is this is a very small area, and it will, if you try to tighten it, it's going to try to compress, and it's going to distort that, and it's going to turn out of balance, and you don't want that. So I'm making some very light back cuts to shape the thickness of this foot. I basically want this foot to be the same diameter as the inside of the bowl, or the same thickness rather. Now I'm going to take this little nub down a bit more with the bowl gouge. Now I'm going to come in with my spindle detail gouge. And the ideal shape for the bottom of the bowl is a convex shape that continues the shape of the exterior of the bowl. So in other words, if I were to basically remove the foot right now, the outside of the bowl should just be a nice round continuous flowing shape without any interruptions. So here I'm just gently making a convex shape for the bottom of the inside of the foot, and then I will further reduce the nub down to pretty much nothing, and then I apply pressure forward and turn the lathe off, and that will sever those last fibers. Now we can just remove the bowl. I need to sand off that little area where the nub was. You can just use the edge of the sanding pad to do that. It's looking pretty good. Okay, so now I'm going to apply oil to this. Now I can hear a bunch of you sighing with a little bit of apprehension. Yes, it is going to change the color of it a bit. There's really no way around this, not if we're going to protect this bowl and actually have it turn out decently. The reason I'm using Danish oil, which is just pure linseed oil, this is tried and true Danish oil, and I have a larger container. I keep a small container of this in a jar handy like this. And I'm applying it pretty thickly because that in grain area is very porous and very dry. And now that it's been exposed from turning, it's going to dry out even quicker. This wood is not 100% dry, so it's going to continue to distort and dry, and the in grain is going to go very quickly compared to the side grain. By applying the oil so that it soaks down into those fibers, it's going to stunt that drying process, and it kind of lubricates those in grains so that they're not releasing moisture as quickly as they were before, and it balances out the bowl a little bit more. Now, I do not want to keep a lot of oil on this bowl for long at all. This Danish oil, if it's left on thick and it's just left alone, it will dry out and become gummy where the thick areas appear. So I'm going to, right off the bat, I'm going to take and wipe down any heavy thick areas and make sure that there's no excess oil on this bowl, because we do not want a gummy finish on this. Now later I may come back and apply a lacquer to this, but this is what we've got at the moment. And look at that bowl. Look at the red staining inside this box elder. Is that gorgeous or what? Nature is just amazing. Now there's some torn out areas in the pith and the in grain, and I'm fine with that, because you know what? It's part of the natural look of this piece. But look at the textures and the colors that are going on in there. Absolutely amazing. I am so excited about this piece, and I am really excited to turn more box elder. I would like to get some of it that's maybe not quite as aged as this and doesn't have a punky pith, but I think you see how we can work through those issues. It's not as hard as it looks, and it can definitely be done, but look at those results. Wow. Well, there it is. I'll tell you, this was a bit of a workout. There's a lot that goes into dealing with punky in-grain wood, and I want to encourage you not to give up. If you get into a piece of wood that's punky like this one, don't give up. Hopefully you learned some lessons from this video of how to deal with it. One of the biggest ones is maintaining a sharp bowl gouge at all times, and you're going to have to stop and go sharpen it and freshen it up again. But once you have your sharpening station and your system all set up, going back and refreshing that blade is super simple. And if you need to learn more about that, check out my tool sharpening online e-course, where I'll show you everything you need to know to make sure you have sharp tools. You have to have sharp tools to cut through that loose fiber. If you've got a dull tool, it's just going to rip those in grains out, and you're going to have all kinds of problems, and it's going to look really bad. And you can't sand this out. You can sand some of it and reduce the look of it, but what happens is, if you think about it, each one of those areas where the wood grain, those fibers, if this is the surface of the bowl and some of those fibers get knocked out, well, you would have to sand all the way back to that lower surface to make this whole thing look nice and smooth. And that's a lot of sanding. Also, you need to make clean cuts all the way down to that deepest one to make it all smooth as well, without ripping out any new fibers. So it is a challenge, but again, look at this bowl. It's well worth the effort. So again, don't give up on wood that's a little less than perfect, because the end result is well worth it. All right, guys, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you've learned something from this, then leave me a comment below. Let me know what you learned and what you're going to apply to your bowl turning. If you've liked this video, do me a huge favor and click that like button below the screen. I ask you for all my videos you watch, if you can, click that like button. Thank you, I greatly appreciate that. And make sure you're subscribing if you're not already. If you are interested in wood bowl turning, if you're just starting, or if you've been turning for years, or like a lot of guys I hear from, they say they turned back when they were in high school, but they're starting again, which is really cool. But you want to learn all the details so that you can make a bowl like this, or you make the bowl that you're imagining in your mind. Go to my website, turnawoodbowl.com. There I've got everything you're going to need to know to really get into the details of turning wood bowls. So check that out. All right, guys, until next time, as always, happy turning.